The subject for my talk today is exploring the meaning of Indigenous military service for Indigenous participants in the Second World War, using participant carefully. Tim. What was the meaning of military service for Indigenous men who volunteered to fight in the Army in the Second World War? On the surface, it seems a relatively simple question, though certainly invested with a degree of gravitas because of the nature of the service and sacrifice being considered. But at its core, this question can also help to explore what is often sort of the big why question people tend to come up with when they first encounter this subject. And that is that why did Indigenous peoples who were marginalized socially, economically, and politically choose to engage with and serve alongside settler societies in the Second World War? Perhaps surprisingly, Indigenous oral testimonies and written accounts often don't bother to explore or expand on the choices behind enlisting. Perhaps the ideas were so self-evident within the totalizing context of the Second World War that they did not need elaboration. Nevertheless, reconstructing the meaning of service can perhaps move us closer to understanding the broader Indigenous experience and involvement in the Second World War. Now, there has been a substantial literature that's grown over the past few decades exploring Indigenous participation in both world wars in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. These various national historiographies each have their strengths and weaknesses, but they share a couple of characteristics that I think are noteworthy. First, overwhelmingly scholars in each country have tended to examine Indigenous military service within the conceptual construct of the nation, effectively siloing a phenomenon that had many parallels across these settler societies and in fact beyond to, as we just heard, Taiwan and Japan and the Micronesian Islands. The second characteristic shared in these national studies is a tendency to examine Indigenous military service in isolation from and effectively segregating Indigenous servicemen from their comrades in arms alongside whom they served. Overwhelmingly, Indigenous servicemen, outside a few examples, served integrated into settler forces. Now, this focus then specifically on Indigenous soldiers is understandable, but it also tends to concentrate analysis then on the rationales and meanings that were distinct to Indigenous peoples for cultural, political, or other reasons. Downplayed or even overlooked were meanings that Indigenous servicemen may well have shared with their non-Indigenous comrades in arms. And for these reasons, my study examines Indigenous military service in settler armies, both transnationally, but also looking at shared and distinct meanings of military service. Now, meaning is by its very nature situational, fluid, and defined within a specific context. The particular ideas, pressures, impulses that persuaded a man to enter a recruiting office provide a framework of meaning prior to Indigenous men enlisting in the military. Once in the military, this was undoubtedly altered by actually participating in a military force and in combat, where a new set of meanings developed to make sense of those experiences. And once an Indigenous soldier returned home, after hostilities ended and transitioned into civilian life and veteran status, the meaning of their military service continued to evolve in the context of their post-war world and lived experience. So this study then looks at all of these different phases, exploring the meanings both shared and distinct. And ultimately, this quest, I think, reveals much about the diverse interpretations prevalent amongst Indigenous veterans in specific times and places. But it cannot be definitive in saying there is a set meaning or group of meanings for Indigenous soldiers because of the complexity and the ultimately idiosyncratic nature and intensely personal nature of a veteran's lived experience. Across the American, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand armies, Indigenous men served in the thousands, the vast majority incorporated as individuals, within mostly non-Indigenous units. Few exceptions, principally 28th Mounted Battalion, Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion, amongst others, where Indigenous service personnel served in segregated units would have provided some distinctions on what I'm talking about. But overwhelmingly, voluntarism forms the predominant narrative of Indigenous entry into the settler armies, even though all four states developed some forms of conscription. Before enlisting, before even donning a uniform, military service already was invested with diverse meanings for many young Indigenous men. If this were not the case, they would never have been moved to offer themselves for military service. Rationales for such decisions would have varied from one individual to the next, and from one cultural community to the next, with each young man that volunteered likely motivated by their own particular constellation of meaning. Most frequently discussed amongst these are the notions of young men seeking the cultural recognition and status of warriors within their own Indigenous communities, while through the vehicle of fighting in a settler army. Amongst the Maori and some Indigenous peoples in North America, a warrior ethos still had deep cultural roots and vibrancy in the mid-20th century. And so for young men raised in a culture where veneration of a warrior masculine code could provide a potent rationale for wanting to enlist in the settler military. I think it is important, though, to guard against overplaying this particular component. This was not evident across all Indigenous societies in North America, nor indeed was it prevalent amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Many Indigenous men, I think, framed their rationale for volunteering also as a means to protecting their own homelands and their own peoples. And for this reason and others, Indigenous enlistment should not necessarily be read as somehow validating or indicating support for the colonial systems that subjugated their peoples. Indeed, sometimes Indigenous enlistment could be a political act intended to unsettle colonial structures, to challenge the frameworks of belonging and identity, and of Indigenous marginalization. There were other meanings for enlisting, though, that transcended ethnic boundaries. Most common was the understanding of military service as economic opportunity, as Jean-Philippe was talking about in the context of the First World War. This was prevalent for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous soldiers, particularly coming out of the Great Depression. Others joined because all their buddies were going, or in search of adventure and the opportunity of travel. Some meanings overlapped between non-Indigenous enlistees and Indigenous enlistees, but with particular nuances, perhaps, for an Indigenous recruit. Notions of patriotism, for instance, or a sense of duty or loyalty were very much in the foreground for many would-be soldiers, but those would have distinct and subtle differences in meaning for Indigenous recruits. Often these were also statements of belonging, of declarations of the right to take part in what was increasingly a national crusade in each of these settler states. Other Indigenous veterans and volunteers found inspiration closer to home in the examples of fathers and uncles who had served in the Great War, and of familial traditions of military service that dated back much longer than that. Ultimately, the decision then to enlist arose from a rich array of different meanings, often working in concert to persuade a young Maori, Native American, Canadian Aboriginal, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australian to step forward. Now, as a soldier put on a uniform, they crossed an invisible but irreversible boundary beyond which their understanding of what their service meant would be transformed. Subsequent experiences of basic training, and particularly of combat, would form strong emotional bonds within the company or platoon to which they were posted. And these intense interpersonal connections between soldiers and small units cut through peacetime identifiers that distinguished indigene from settler, and would come to form the core of meaning in military service. Indigenous and non-Indigenous understandings of military service, I would argue, within the military, converged, became more alike than they had been before the war. And they did so in more than just their camaraderie. In spite of the tendency among scholars to treat Indigenous soldiers as separate and exceptional, the human, physiological, and psychological responses to the fear, acute stress, the brutality, and the intensity of modern warfare crossed ethnic boundaries. Men in combat all struggled to manage its powerful mental and physical needs and demands, and they depended on their mates to help them get through. It's important also to include Indigenous soldiers alongside their comrades in terms of shared meanings and understandings of battle, but that does not mean that we subsume Indigenous soldiers then in a blanket of sameness. Despite military training designed to reconstruct individuals as members of a unit with a shared military masculine code of behavior and the cohesion forged in combat, soldiers still retained much of themselves within the Army. While it's always somewhat nebulous and probably impossible to measure, the cultural conditioning they experienced while growing up in their communities before the war would have left Indigenous soldiers with unique lenses through which to understand their experiences. And this could come in a multiplicity of fashions. You might find distinct coping mechanisms, in particular medicines that Indigenous soldiers would take with them to war, for instance. Now, undoubtedly, there was a lot of overlap between military masculine codes and Indigenous masculine codes of behavior, but nevertheless, understandings of fundamental concepts like death, hate, revenge, courage, cowardice, sacrifice, all of these things have culturally specific definitions. And so the meanings for Indigenous soldiers whilst in the military were thus shared, but also potentially and powerfully shaped by their own cultural upbringing and worldview in certain circumstances. There's one additional meaning for Indigenous personnel, not only for Indigenous personnel, but also for some other ethnic minorities in military service. And this was of military service as an egalitarian experience, where they were accepted and respected for their abilities and their character, and where their indigeneity did not prevent an equal relationship. And it's really striking because almost all Indigenous veterans speak to this aspect of their war experience in some way, shape, or form. That brings us to the post-war, because the war's end would bring yet another transformation for these individuals, profound one, as they demobilized and returned to Civvy Street. Subsequently, the meaning of their war experience would be defined and shaped by hindsight and the shifting contexts and experiences of their post-war lives. The dominant narratives, of course, in each settler society have constructed the Second World War as the good war, in which the greatest generation did its thing and the Antipodean Digger legends were renewed and reinvigorated. And that warm collective memory would subsequently rest on the broadly positive eras that followed in each country of dynamic economic growth and prosperity in subsequent decades, in which the majority of returned service personnel would participate, boosted often in the immediate post-war years by access to generous and flexible veterans benefits provided in each settler state. Indigenous servicemen's place in that otherwise warm, fuzzy narrative is not entirely clear yet. Certainly the meaning of the post-war emotions and experiences would have paralleled many of those demobilizing soon-to-be soldiers, whether Indigenous or otherwise. You know, the joy of homecoming, the relief at the reunion with loved ones, cut across boundaries. A joy blended also with a sense of accomplishment. They'd gone overseas and achieved something. After the flurry of welcome at the return, Indigenous veterans then turned their attention to the challenging task of civilian reestablishment. Most managed the transition, but it was not a straightforward process for them. Simply adjusting to the often mundane nature of peacetime life and work was hard enough, and some found settling in a successful civilian career challenging. Post-war reminiscences suggest that maybe at least part of their meaning of their military service, when they look back upon it in those post-war years, was a sense of belonging and a purpose that proved elusive in their return to civilian life. Of course, some veterans did not return alone. They returned accompanied by demons and by ghosts. And for many, alcohol would provide an important, if destructive, salve for the veterans for whom the meaning of their military service was psychological pain. Such stories are not generally audible, of course, amidst the cacophony of the good war trope, but they are part of all veterans' lingering connection to the war, Indigenous or not. Some shared meanings persisted, I think, after the war, but the convergence of meaning that we saw during the military experience, during the war itself, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous servicemen would reverse course when the veterans returned home. That wartime convergence had been predicated on a combination of training and combat and intense interpersonal bonds that had minimized the distinctions of indigeneity. Demobilizing and returning to civilian life meant also re-entering a civilian world that was literally altered from pre-war realities, where Indigenous identity powerfully distinguished, separated, and defined the day-to-day realities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous veterans. These differences became more apparent for many Indigenous returned service personnel with their initial welcome home and their early reintegration back into their communities, because these processes were often culturally prescribed and distinct. So for example, at his welcome, Joseph Medicine Crow sang his war song describing his military accomplishments during the war to Crow elders in the United States in order to prove that he had performed the requisite courageous deeds to be accepted as a warrior and war chief amongst his people. But for veterans of other Indigenous communities, such as Coast Salish or Zuni, southwest US, their war service meant not so much positive things in their community, but instead marked them as tainted or culturally threatening or problematic. Culturally defined understandings of war and of warriors in some cases extended to unique ceremonies and to medicines that offered Indigenous veterans struggling with what we would understand today as post-traumatic stress disorder, unique ways to cope and perhaps to heal that were not available to non-Indigenous veterans. Culturally defined meanings thus infused military service with increasingly different nuances for Indigenous veterans in the post-war years than their non-Indigenous friends. However, another factor would immediately rear its head on their return home, and that was the return to settler prejudice. For John Rangahau, who had served with the Maori Battalion, it altered his feelings about the war. In his words, "We came back into a situation which had not changed in any way, where we were still treated as second-class citizens, where we were still not allowed to purchase alcohol. Suddenly there was an annoying thing at the pit of your stomach about having gone away to free this beautiful land and yet still be treated as aliens in our own country." Given their sacrifices, such experiences frequently began to alter the meaning of their military service in the Second World War for Indigenous veterans. Homecoming to Indigenous communities and reserves also, of course, meant the return to the regulatory regimes and intrusive state colonial controls. Cree veteran Gordon Henneque recalled how, especially at that age when I came back, I was bitter against the Indian Agent and the Indian Act, the government. It's almost, funny how a freedom-loving people, we were just closed in, simply closed in. In addition to this, in each country, veterans programs were crafted, administered, sometimes distorted in ways that created unequal access to those benefits for Indigenous veterans, and also meant a lower likelihood of translating them into programs for economic reestablishment in civilian life. A common aspect of settler state controls and regulatory regimes was a ban on the consumption of alcohol, which proved symbolically important for many Indigenous veterans who, while in the service, had been able to join their buddies for a beer, but who could no longer do so in peacetime. This actually struck particularly hard at Indigenous veterans because one of the largest challenges returning from the war for any veteran was shifting from the collectivist military life to an individualistic civilian life. The loss of comradeship left many veterans adrift and was an important reason why veterans' halls, Legion halls, became important sites for returning servicemen, a place where they could find solace and support in a pint with people who understood their world. Because they served alcohol, however, Indigenous veterans in most settler jurisdictions could not enter these establishments. And this cut them off then from that possibility of other comrades in arms as fellowship in the post-war world. Now, these colonial legislative and regulatory systems, of course, had long intruded on the daily lives of Indigenous peoples in all four of these countries. But after having worn a military uniform, lived as an equal in the service, and sacrificed so much on the altar of democracy and freedom and equality, this kind of treatment was particularly embittering in the wake of the war for Indigenous veterans, and it did tend to reshape their understanding of that conflict. In conclusion, ultimately it's clear that military service was in fact deeply meaningful at various stages to those Māori, Canadian Aboriginal, Native American, and Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islander men who participated in that conflict. At every stage of the process, from civilian to soldier to veteran, a multiplicity of possible factors shaped how these young men understood what it was that they were doing or had done. Many of the meanings influenced Indigenous recruits, soldiers, or veterans in much the same way that they shaped the experience of non-Indigenous veterans. Other factors arising from particular cultural, political, legal, or economic contexts of each Indigenous serviceman could provide different ways in which they perceived their service that were distinct or indeed unique unto themselves. The degrees of similarities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous meanings appear to have been evident before the war. That gap then narrowed within the war and then widened much further after, when the distinctions of indigeneity reasserted themselves after the war. And really in this chapter I focus mostly on that immediate post-war transition, but you can carry this forward into more recent times. For these veterans as they moved on into their twilight years, they were all still widely ostracized from local and national acts of remembrance and commemoration, sometimes found themselves campaigning for recognition, remembrance, respect, or perhaps sometimes for the restitution of grievances regarding unequal pay or benefits. And the success of some of those campaigns and the awakening of recognition that has occurred in the recent decades, I think has helped many of these veterans again perhaps begin to reshape their understanding of the service that they've performed, perhaps in more positive directions. Although, perhaps if you ask Navajo code talkers after their visit with President Trump last week, they might not agree with that. Anyway, thank you.